Hello and welcome back, everyone. This is Lesson 8, Section 2, Rome's Conquest of the Italian Peninsula. All right, a lot to cover today. This is going to be from the Republic to Empire. We did a brief covering over what happened in Rome's conquest of the Italian Peninsula, or aka their first expansion. So let's get into it. So today the bell work is on the board. Make sure you jot that down. We will discuss how Rome dealt with its neighboring people. Rome has a lot of neighbors, all right, from different civilizations. The analogy I'm going to use here for the different civilizations around Rome is going to be like cities in Ohio. There's a lot of similarities between these cities. However, uh, the Romans, the Romans are still going to be fighting and having disagreements with their neighbors. All right, so Bellwork is on the board. Make sure you jot that down. Let's go ahead and get started. So Rome's first expansion lasted 200 years. 200 years, so you can see that it didn't happen overnight. This is a slow, methodical process. All right, so slowly but surely the Romans would expand, and eventually the Romans would take over the entire Italian peninsula. If you look at the picture in the top right corner, you can see all these different groups of Italian and Roman neighbors. We have Rome over here in the orange, but then you have the Umbrians, the Etruscans, as we talked about at length. They're going to be overthrown in year 500 by Brutus. We talked about that story. The Celts up north, but then we even have the Greeks a little bit in the south. We have the Carthaginians from northern Africa in this area. So we have a lot of different neighbors and civilizations around that the Romans will have to deal with. One of the civilizations that were very near them, it was the Latins. The Latins aren't going to be on this map here, but the Latins are one of the first people that the Romans actually teamed up with. They formed an alliance with, they signed a peace treaty with the Latins. So we're going to make peace our key word. Peace is going to be our key word. One of our few instances of peace the Romans displayed here early on. So peace is going to be our key word. All right, so the Romans will try to spread their Roman influence. Their goal is to get bigger, to get stronger, and eventually to take over the Italian peninsula. It would happen. It would take 200 years. They would accomplish their goals, but there is going to be a lot of hiccups during the process. So we're going to get to that and more throughout 8.2. All right, Rome took over the entire Italian peninsula during its first expansion. We could see here Italy in the southern portion of Europe, Rome specifically on the seas or on the shores of the Tyrrhenian Sea. And if keep in mind here, all right, keep in mind this area in Tunisia. All right, the reason why I want you to keep that in mind is because that's where the Carthaginians are going to be from. And in 8.3, when we get there, the Carthaginians are going to be a thorn on the side of the Romans. All right, so the peace treaty, a translation from part of the peace treaty that took place between the Romans and the Latins, is as follows: there shall be peace between the Romans and the communities of Latins as long as heaven and earth endure. Let me read that one more time for you and then we'll discuss. There shall be peace between the Romans and all the communities of Latins as long as heaven and earth endure. Now, what exactly does that mean? That means here that as long as the Romans exist, as long as the community of Latins exists, as long as those civilizations exist, as long as Earth exists, they will honor that peace treaty that they wrote. All right, so they will be allies. They will work together. All right, so that is what that quote means. Part of the peace treaty that they signed early in before year zero in the BCE era. All right, as we just mentioned, the Romans and Latins became allies, and they were very similar groups of people. If you were living in the other side of the world, say you were in Asia and you came over, you'd be like, well, what's the difference between the Romans and Latins? Almost as if like Cleveland and Akron, all right? Two different cities, and you could tell if you live in Akron that Cleveland's different, and Cleveland could tell that Akron's different. But if you're coming from all around the other side of the world, you might not think that there's that much difference. You'd be like, okay, yeah, you are the same people. That's what the Latins and Romans were. Very similar, spoke the same language. In fact, Romans spoke Latin mostly. Okay, so there was some similarities, a lot of similarities between the two groups. And then they started to team up as allies to fight wars against the Etruscan groups. All right, so there were disputes amongst territory and trade routes specifically. So we're going to make territory our keyword. Territory is going to be our keyword. Territory. The reason why is because trade routes was a huge part of how you get bigger. If you need supplies, you need trade routes. And the territory that was owned by the Romans was good, but they needed more land for roads and for trading on land, right? So a lot of these trade routes were going through other smaller city states like the Samnites, like the Etruscans, like the Greeks, other civilizations in the area, right? So the Latins and the Romans would have to kind of try and fight these other small tribes, get them out of there so they can start expanding their trade routes. All right, so that was the reason for it. The Etruscans going to be the first ones to go. Another one, the Samnites as well, as the Romans will make their way up and down the modern day Italian peninsula. All right, so true or false here, the Romans and Latins became allies because of their peace treaty. That would make this absolutely true. All right, before, as I mentioned, the Romans, it was not all just fun and games for them. There were hiccups along the way as they were conquering the Italian peninsula. Over those 200 years, a lot did happen. Like in the year 390 BCE, when Rome actually nearly came to an end before it ever became an empire, before they even ever left Italy for good. This happened because a band of Gauls stormed the city. You might be asking, what is a Gaul? Well, first, a Gaul is a small tribe of warlike people. And you can see that pictured in the top right corner, a depiction of what the Gauls might have looked like. And Gauls are going to be people coming from that France area, northwest of Italy. All right, so Gauls, people coming from the northwest area of Italy, mostly like the France area, and maybe even connected to the Vikings at some point. So we're going to make Gauls our keyword. Gauls is going to be our keyword. The Gauls actually stormed into the city and nearly ended Rome. So let's get into the details of that. Gauls are a keyword. So they caught the Romans off guard. The reason why the Romans weren't paying too much attention to their own city, their own capital of the city of Rome, is because the soldiers that they had were too busy fighting these other small tribes amongst or along the Italian peninsula, right? There were a little bit people in the south, in the east, in the northeast, all right? So fighting all these little civilizations, these little battles, these little wars, that the city itself, defenses were low. And here come the Gauls storming in, looting the city, stealing. All right, so stealing, looting, uh, burning the city and buildings within the city down. All right, they attempted to destroy the entire city of Rome. Luckily for the Romans, it wasn't a full success, although it was pretty damaged and destroyed, but not enough for them to abandon the city completely. The Romans would then attempt to build the city back up. However, this did a lot of damage to the Romans. The Romans would have to learn their lesson and figure out a way to protect their city from the Gauls and other groups like the Gauls to uh, potentially prevent other future attacks. All right, so I want you to take a look at this. The Gauls were from modern day France. France, northwest, right? Northwest of Italy. All right, there is the Alp Mountains in the top right corner of Italy in the northwest, so it is hard to cross the Alp Mountains. So they didn't think that maybe that they were going to have any invaders. But the Mediterranean Sea, you can sail right into the city of Rome. Rome is near the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. That is the way to attack the Romans. All right, so the city of Rome was left in ruins. There was a lot of issues the Romans would have to adjust. If they're going to try to expand, that's all well and good, but you're going to have to defend the city, your capital, right? You can't leave yourself exposed to all these outside attacks. So, what did the Romans decide to do? The Romans decided to rebuild what was burned and from there add a wall around the city. So, we're going to make wall our keyword. Wall is going to be our keyword. That was going to be the way that the Romans defended their city state, right? By putting a giant wall up, pictured in the bottom right corner. This is a pretty big wall, right? So it's going to be, 30, 40, 50 feet up into the air. Okay, so making it for strong protection, a fortified wall around the city. But not only that, they also started training a massive army that way that they can continue their attacks through other civilizations in the Italian peninsula, and they were really now paranoid that this would happen again with the Gauls. So their attention was now twofold: defense and offense, not just one or the other. All right, so the Romans would have to make adjustments. Again, this was a hiccup along the way of their conquest of the Italian peninsula. All right, we are halfway through. This is a tribute to one of my former students who put these faces on the slides here. But so far, we talked about the Italian peninsula and the conquest of the Romans, the Gauls slowing down their progress, but the Latins and the Romans did make an agreement to become allies, and they are going to have their successes from that point on. All right, so as Rome started to get the ball rolling a little bit, they started conquering other neighboring tribes in the area, especially around the year 300 BCE. They did completely take over the Samnites to the south, one of the first groups to fall to our Roman civilization. They also took over some of those Greek city-states that were lingering in the southern portion of the Italian peninsula. If you recall from chapter one, we talked about how the Greeks ran out of food because the population was thriving in that area. So some people left to settle elsewhere. Some of the area that they settled was the southern portion of the Italian peninsula, spreading Greek influence. Well, now the Romans were able to take over those remaining Greek ancestors that were living in the area. The Italian peninsula was now completely Rome's by the year 275 BCE, after the Etruscans fell, the Greeks fell, the Samnites fell. But once again, because of this conquest, the Romans stretched themselves thin. They left themselves exposed. Despite building a wall, they left themselves exposed to another attack. And yet again, here come the Gauls from the French area, modern day France area, to burn parts of Rome down yet again. If you look at the picture in the top right corner, you could see Rome, a depiction of Rome on fire because of soldiers coming in via boats to burn down the city of Rome. All right, so Rome almost fell a second time because of the Gauls. However, Rome was able to kind of navigate their way through these issues, and they were becoming more powerful. So we're going to make peninsula our keyword. Peninsula is going to be our keyword, as the Romans captured the entire Italian peninsula by 275 BCE, making them the most powerful group in Italy at the time, before Italy was established as a country. And now the Romans are going to look elsewhere to expand and become more successful. So peninsula is going to be our keyword. Peninsula. What should the Romans do to protect themselves from the Gauls? I'll let you think about that, because so far they're having a lot of issues doing this. All right, so there is problems with the Gauls that they're going to have to address. All right, so as expansion and Rome started to get bigger, doesn't mean everything was peaceful within the Roman Empire. It doesn't mean that everyone was thriving within the Roman Empire. If you can recall from chapter 7 that we just finished talking about, the patricians and the plebeians, this was the time in which the plebeians were getting frustrated at the patrician. This was happening at the same time. All right, so our chapters are overlapping a little bit here. So last chapter we talked about the people, now we're talking about expansion, but these things are happening at the exact same time. The Romans, because of the issues with the Gauls, are forcing the plebeians to serve in the military. This is when the plebeians felt like they were not being represented enough, and this is when the plebeians started to protest. All right, so we're going to make plebeian our key word. Plebeian is going to be our key word. This is when the plebeians were very upset with the upper class, the patricians, because of their decision making. All right, the patricians were thinking big. They were thinking maybe more than just Italy. Maybe we want more than Italy. We need more soldiers. We need to protect Rome. We need to keep expanding. We need to keep protecting our trade routes. Well, this is what led to the conflict between the plebeians and the patricians, the civil war, if you will, within Rome. All right, so the plebeians grew angry, and they led to civil conflict. So these things are going to be happening at the same moment during the first expansion of the Roman Empire. All right, so we will wrap things up, and then we're going to be talking about the second, third, and fourth expansion coming in the next several days. So, what Romans were forced to serve in the military? As you know, the patricians are the upper class of the Roman Republic. The upper class tends to send the lower class into battle, unfortunately. So plebeians were forced to serve in the military. That would be the plebeians. All right, so to wrap things up here, citizens were not the only people who were sacrificing themselves for expansion. The plebeians obviously had to do a lot of the dirty work, but they were not the only ones because people that the Romans were conquering were also getting involved with the Roman expansion as well. So let me pitch this example for you for a second. Let's say you are a person that were part of the Samnites civilization or city state. The Samnites are now taken over by the Romans. You were not killed in this endeavor, but now you are a Roman citizen. So now you're a part of Rome, okay? But you are going to be forced to fight. You're going to be forced to fight for Roman expansion. Even though you have no loyalty to the Romans, you are now forced to battle for them. They did not treat you well. They did not feed you well. They made you pay extra taxes. All right, so you had no money, and your life did not get better because you were under control by the Roman Empire. So they were getting forced to fight. They were not in a good position. So the people, not only the Samnites, but Etruscans, maybe Southern Greeks, Sardinians and other little groups like that are now being forced to work for the Romans despite their best interest. All right. So by 250 BCE, all right, we're getting closer to year zero, but we're still in that before the Common Era time period. That the army size was massive. It was huge. There was so many soldiers. All right, because of the Gauls that motivated them, and then their motivation to try to claim more trade lands and trade routes, that they started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And now from there, they're going to set their sight on Carthage because the Carthaginians are going to be the ones that are controlling the water, the trade routes in the Mediterranean Sea. They were cutting off a lot of trade with the Greeks, and now they're going to be a thorn in the side of the Romans. So after the Italian peninsula is conquered, more challenges await because the Carthaginians in the south are going to be pestering them, especially in the island of Sicily. So Sicily is going to be the focal point of 8.3, and we'll get there next class. All right, so that's going to make our keyword conquered. Conquered is going to be our keyword as the Romans conquered the entire Italian peninsula, and they're going to set their sights on more land, more sea, and more territory from there. So conquered is going to be our keyword, conquered. All right, that is the end of our lesson. Hopefully that helps you get some clarity on the first expansion of the Roman Empire. If you have questions, I will be around. Like and subscribe. Thank you.